Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. I'm gonna give my thoughts on the historian Arch Getty. He's a Sovietologist, or a historian of the Soviet Union, pretty much exclusively of the Stalin period. And the reason that Getty is worth talking about is that Arch Getty is seen by many communists, at least in the West, as a good historian, or a good bourgeois historian, perhaps even the best bourgeois historian of the Soviet Union. And what I mean by bourgeois historian is that he's not a communist, he's not pro-communist in any way. He is a supporter of capitalism and a supporter of the capitalist point of view, but he's still seen by many as maybe even the best historian of the Soviet Union of the Stalin period. Is that warranted? Well, in some ways it is, and in some ways it really isn't. I certainly started reading Getty's books because people said like, oh well, you should read Getty. He's pretty good, maybe even the best, as far as Western capitalist historians go. So I started reading his books, and I've read all of them now. He only has 5 books. I'm gonna go over each of them and talk about them. But before I do that, I'll say some preliminary remarks. My experience with reading capitalist history books has been that even though my expectations were not all that high, somehow I've still consistently been disappointed. I expected the work to be better. Same goes for capitalist philosophy as well. I don't know why, but even when I started reading capitalist philosophy books, I was expecting there to be some kind of reasonable, factual basis to things, and that never seems to be the case. When I started reading capitalist books about philosophy, I got extremely disappointed. I didn't find answers to any of the questions that I had. In reading capitalist history books, on numerous occasions I've thought, I just want to find a history book which gives a reasonable interpretation and just gives the basic facts from a somewhat neutral standpoint, some kind of clear explanation of historical events based on at least some kind of evidence. It doesn't have to be like absolutely perfect evidence, but at least somewhat strong. And more often than not, even with such low expectations, I'm still disappointed. Almost all capitalist history books, in the end, they're largely baseless. It's not based on anything. In the case of Arch Getty, there's probably like 33% or 1/3 that's actual facts or some kind of useful factual information. Then another 33% is just his opinions, which are often not based on anything, or interpretations or some kind of speculations that are not based on anything, or oftentimes they seem to be like distortions. And then the remaining 33% is just anti-communist propaganda. So let's start going through the books. The first book is Origins of the Great Purges, the Soviet Communist Party Reconsidered, 1933 to 1938. Originally written in 1985, but I think revised in 1996. I don't know exactly what he changed about it. And I think that this actually is Arch Getty's best book, as weird as that sounds, because it's his first book, and also it was written before the Soviet archives were, I don't want to say fully opened, because they've never been fully opened, but they were less open when he wrote this book than they were afterwards. But anyway, for this book I actually had pretty high expectations when I first read it, because I had heard a lot of good things about it. However, when I read the entire thing, it kind of disappointed me, because it is still very anti-communist. But now, looking back, I do still consider it a very significant book. This book did what Arch Getty is really known for. He challenged the usual Cold War narrative of the Soviet Union, and he challenged what he calls the totalitarian paradigm, which was this idea that Stalin was this all-powerful dictator who had complete full knowledge and also complete control about everything that ever happened in the USSR. Which sounds ridiculous, but that is kind of how history of the USSR was written back in the day, and to an extent is still written to this day. they would always write Soviet history from the point of view of Stalin, as if like, on this day Stalin had this grand plan to kill everybody and then he did it, which contains a ton of baseless assumptions. Assumption 1, that Stalin had some kind of grand plan and he wasn't just improvising. Assumption 2, that he somehow controlled everything and therefore if he had a plan he could make it happen exactly as he wanted. And 3, that nothing could happen to change his plans, or that nobody could hinder his plans or whatever. So these more old school books, which were really just propaganda and not history writing at all, which would claim that basically Stalin was just this evil monster who had evil plans and then he orchestrated them and carried them out. And the Great Purge, the so-called Great Purge of the 1930s, was always seen as something that Stalin had orchestrated and something that he had planned from the get-go. That he had planned, okay, I'm gonna assassinate Kirov and then I'm gonna use that as an excuse to eliminate all my enemies and then I'm gonna pull it off. And there's gonna be Moscow trials and all these things. And what Getty does in this book is that he challenges all of that. He says that actually Stalin probably never had any kind of plan to do that, but it was more of a spontaneous thing that just happened. Getty also pretty convincingly showed, and this is probably the best element of the book, he showed that the local party officials and the local state officials were oftentimes kind of doing their own thing, and Stalin might have limited, and the government in general might have only limited knowledge of what's going on in the country, and then they would react based on the limited knowledge and limited information they have, and they would give orders to other officials, and then those other officials might not carry out the orders at all, or they might not carry them out the way they were intended, either on purpose or by accident. So Getty describes and depicts the Great Terror or the Great Purge as a very chaotic, spontaneous phenomena which wasn't really controlled fully by anybody. There were just certain currents, certain developments happening at the same time which kind of all merged into this one chaotic process, which then developed in somewhat unpredictable ways. Examples that he gives, which are actually pretty good examples now that I think about it, is the anti-bureaucracy and pro-democracy movement led by Stalin and in particular Andrei Zhdanov. That anti-bureaucracy and pro-democracy movement, for instance, you can see it in the fact that there was the so-called Stalin Constitution, the 1936 Constitution, which gave full democratic rights to everybody, and Stalin even wanted there to be contested elections, while at the same time Zhdanov was able to push for contested elections and full democracy inside the party, which had previously not existed. Previously there had been a thing called co-optation, where local party leaders didn't need to have elections necessarily, they could just co-opt new people. So let's say that there's a party leadership in some local area, let's say like Belarusia or something. So the Belarusian party leadership thinks, okay, we need 2 more people into the leadership. Oh, that guy's good and that guy's good, let's take them, and then they just accept them directly into the leadership without having to have any kind of elections about it. That was called co-optation, and that was abolished as part of this democracy movement. So on the one hand, there's the democracy movement, then there's also the tendency to criticize and go against and even persecute bourgeois specialists and bourgeois experts, and to persecute Trotskyists, for instance. And then eventually those could all merge. The anti-bureaucratism and the pro-democracy stuff, that was entirely peaceful. But going after saboteurs, for instance, could be violent. Well, during the Purge, even the anti-bureaucracy stuff became violent. So now, if somebody was a bureaucrat, they might charge him with some kind of crime, like sabotage or some kind of criminal corruption. And this way of looking at the Great Purge as something more spontaneous that developed based on actual real things, instead of just being a the evil plan of one leader, Stalin. This way of looking at things started to be called the revisionist school of Soviet history, which means that they were like trying to revise how Soviet history was looked at. So it's still an anti-communist way of looking at Soviet history, because they still argue that communism is bad and that communism leads to mass killings and whatnot. But it's not quite as ridiculous as the old school Cold War way of looking at it. So Getty's book, Origin of the Great Purges, was influential for that, and it was also influential for one other thing. And this sounds ridiculous, but it was one of the earliest attempts to write Soviet history actually based on real evidence. Because in the past, Robert Conquest, who was the most well-known and well-respected historian of the Soviet Union back in the day, and he was really just a hack and a pure propagandist and terrible historian, but he was still the most well-respected at the time, and he literally said that rumor is a totally acceptable and even a good source for information about the USSR. So he would write stuff based on rumors and hearsay, based on Nazi propaganda and enemy propaganda against the USSR. He would take all of those as sources that he would use to write supposed history. And of course, the history that he wrote was not history at all. It was just complete BS and just nonsense. So Getty, already in the 80s, he had access to some archival stuff, and he used that. And he also criticized the way that Soviet history had been written before. And he criticizes a lot of the sources that Robert Conquest and other people like that had used in the past. And all of that I found interesting and useful. But then, would I recommend this book to anybody? Well, if you're a student of history, or if you really want to research the USSR pretty deeply, then yeah, read the book. But if you want to know what actually happened, don't read the book, because it doesn't tell you what actually happened. It debunks the totalitarian paradigm. It debunks a lot of individual myths and falsehoods about the USSR. But at the end of the day, it's still a very anti-communist book. And even though it debunks a lot of falsehoods, it also supports a ton of anti-communist falsehoods. And if the previous argument that, let's say, Robert Conquest makes is that communism is bad because communists are just evil and they have an all-powerful totalitarian state, well, Getty doesn't agree with that, but instead he claims that communism is bad because it still leads to terrible atrocities, but through accident or through more chaotic and complicated processes. Getty actually claims that the Soviet Union was not totalitarian only because it didn't have the technology to be truly totalitarian. He has also constantly stressed that the so-called evil of communism is somehow more evil because when you examine the people, the Soviet communists, it turns out that they're not some kind of crazy monsters, but they're just ordinary people, and they still do all kinds of horrible things and atrocities. So Getty's book is deeply anti-communist. It's just a little bit smarter and more complicated than something like Robert Conquest. And while I think we should give a lot of credit to Arch Getty for going against the Cold War paradigm, I think he himself is also a product of that paradigm. Getty still believes the vast majority of anti-communist assumptions. So even when he tries to construct a history that's actually based on some kind of factual evidence, he still interprets it in a really anti-communist way. And also, not only an anti-communist way, but also just a false way. And at times you can tell that he's really trying to come to anti-communist conclusions, even if the evidence really doesn't point to that. And even though Getty's main point is that Stalin wasn't some all-powerful, all-knowing dictator who controlled everything, he still repeats it over and over and over again, that even then everything is always Stalin's fault, and Stalin is always ultimately responsible for everything just because he's the head of the party or something, which doesn't even really make any sense. So what is the actual value of the book Origins of the Great Purge? Well, it reveals a number of useful facts, and it reveals a number of actual truths that we can use, but I would really never recommend it to any person who is new to communism or who just wants a simple explanation of what happened, because you're not going to get that from the book. To get any value out of the book, you pretty much already have to have a pretty good idea of communist history, and then you can read the book and then you can know, like, oh, okay, well, that's clearly false, and oh, that stuff there, that's good stuff. So you have to read it extremely critically and you have to evaluate everything. So it's an extremely mixed book, but I think it is Getty's best book. His second book, Stalinist Terror, New Perspectives, from 1993, is a book that Getty actually didn't write. Instead, he edited it. It's a collection of different articles. Basically, each chapter is an article by a different person, different historian, and it gathers a lot of these revisionist historians, a lot of these people who are writing similar kind of history to Arch Getty, such as Lynn Viola, Sheila Fitzpatrick. And I have to say, I didn't really like the book. Most of these articles don't really contribute anything. Usually they get stuff wrong simply because they don't understand Marxism, which is very strange in one sense, because you would expect these people to be like experts. But then again, they are bourgeois, they're capitalist historians, so it almost comes with the territory that they wouldn't understand. There's one short article about Yezhov, there's an article by Lynn Viola about class enemies in the countryside, which has some useful information. It talks about how, like, there was still a lot of division in the countryside. People knew who had been Reds and who had been Whites in the Civil War. People even knew who had supported, like, Tsarist-era privatizations and Tsarist-era, like, Enclosure Act types of reforms, like the Stalin reform and stuff like that. And that contributed to who the villagers considered to be, like, class enemies during the collectivization and stuff like that. So it has some interesting stuff, but then it's just drowned in a sea of anti-communist BS. All of Manning's articles in this I really hated. Robert Thurston has an article in this, which I also really disliked. Thurston's book, Life and Terror in Stalin's Russia, is also another book that a lot of Marxists kind of like. And while that book is also deeply flawed, it's much, much better than Thurston's article in this book. I mean, goddamn, to me, even Sheila Fitzpatrick's article called The Impact of the Great Purges on Soviet Elites, a case study from Moscow and Leningrad telephone directories of the 1930s. Like, to me, the whole topic of the article is just random, and it tells us nothing. Like, she tries to calculate what percentage of the elite was eliminated by the purge, and she does it by looking at how many people's names disappear from the phone directory. Like, that sounds so dumb and pointless. If I remember correctly, the article by Getty and Chase, called Patterns of Repression Among the Soviet Elites in the Late 30s, that might be the article where it says that so-called old Bolsheviks were not any more likely to have suffered in the purge compared to any state official or communist official. If that's the article where he says that, then okay, yeah, there's like one useful thing that he points out. But all the rest of this book, to me, felt super unfocused, super messy. Especially all of Manning's articles just had this really biased tone. And all the articles also just seem very mediocre, and they don't really say anything all that useful or all that interesting. With one notable exception. Roger R. Rees's article, The Red Army and the Great Purges. That's a good one. Now, of course, it is an anti-communist article. It does bash communism all the time. It throws in all kinds of random attacks against communism and the USSR and whatnot. However, it examines the numbers of how many soldiers and how many officers and how many army leaders were either arrested, removed from the military, or killed in the Great Terror. And it comes to the conclusion that the number was actually pretty small. It also shows the size of the army leadership and how the size of the army leadership was continually increasing all the time. And it really destroys the Cold War anti-communist myth that the Purges destroyed the Red Army. Because I think it was Robert Conquest who said that Stalin had like 50 to 70% of all military leaders killed. Roger R. Rees just completely demolishes that claim. Rest of the book to me is pretty worthless, which may sound harsh, but that's my opinion. Next book, Road to Terror, Stalin and the Self-Destruction of the Bolsheviks, 1932 to 1939. Titles of all these books just sound so similar. You could almost program like a Arch Getty book title generator and it would give you like Stalinist Purge reevaluated or something. This one, Road to Terror, I didn't hate. It's an interesting book, and what makes it a little different is that it's mostly just documents. It presents just a bunch of documents taken from the archive and then Getty's very long commentary about the documents. It has stuff like Central Committee meetings, Politburo meetings, various conferences of the leadership, also oppositionist documents like the Ryutin platform and stuff like that. It also just has a bunch of documents from various officials, either Stalin or the government sending documents to officials or officials sending documents to Stalin or the government. And that stuff is actually very nice to get. The problem is that they're never the full document. They're always just an excerpt from the document, so we don't really know what was removed. What documents are included? Well, that was just an arbitrary choice made by Getty, based on what kind of point he tries to make. What was the impact of each? Like, let's say it's a document from some state organ to some official. What is the actual impact of this document? Well, we don't really know. We're just supposed to take Getty's word for it. So of course you have to take all of these with a grain of salt as well. But it is nice, generally, to get some of these documents. However, the majority of the book is Getty's own spin and Getty's own commentary on the documents, and I find the commentary to be largely just baseless. Because he says stuff which the documents don't really back up in any way. Let's say it's a Central Committee meeting, and they're just talking about stuff, like, okay, we should do this, we should do that, and then Getty draws some kind of wild conclusion, like, oh, well, this is where Stalin decided that this man was gonna die, or something. Well, how'd you figure that? It doesn't say anything like that in the document. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration. He doesn't quite say that, but I'm just trying to come up with an example, because usually the Central Committee meetings, for instance, they're extremely ordinary. Nothing spectacular really happens at the meetings most of the time. But still, Getty oftentimes comes up with these weird conclusions, even though nothing all that unusual ever happens at the meetings. Perhaps the most insightful out of all the documents and all the things that Getty points out is the Central Committee meeting where Bukharin is being interrogated, and also the stuff about Enukidze, because obviously Bukharin was eventually executed and Enukidze as well, but in both of those instances, other members of the leadership were much harsher and were much more critical of those guys. They said that Enukidze was guilty of gross negligence and yada yada yada, but Stalin instead was pretty lenient and said, okay, we expel him, but next meeting let's consider accepting him back into the party. And same with when other people are saying that Bukharin is clearly a traitor, he's clearly conspiring, Stalin instead is very calm and cool-headed and says, oh, well, let's not jump to any conclusions, let's investigate first, and, maybe Bukharin can still explain all this and whatnot. And Getty points out so many instances of that, where that went on for such a long time, that it clearly shows that the idea that Stalin had some kind of plan from the get-go that, okay, I'm gonna kill Enukidze, I'm gonna kill Bukharin, that clearly didn't happen. unless Stalin is playing some kind of million-dimensional chess where even in these secret Central Committee meetings, he's somehow saying like, okay, guys, so you say we should kill him, and then I come in and I say, no, we shouldn't, and then we really will kill him, or something like, which just doesn't seem likely. So the book does show that Stalin didn't have any kind of premeditated plan to carry out a purge or to eliminate oppositionists. Instead, he just went where the evidence and the situation led him. The book also does debunk some other smaller myths that persisted for a while. Like there was a myth that inside the Stalin Politburo there was a so-called moderate opposition or a so-called liberal opposition. During the Cold War there was an idea that Stalin was a totalitarian extremist, whereas there were other people who were supposedly more democratic and more moderate, namely Kirov, Orjonikidze, and Kuybyshev. And Getty himself even kind of says that in Origins of the Great Purge, but in Road to Terror he shows that that's false. In fact, Kuybyshev was much more extreme than Stalin, and Kirov also was no more moderate than Stalin. Getty also shows that some of the characters who are usually most attacked, such as Stalin, the state procurator Vyshinsky, and Andrei Zhdanov, Getty shows that those guys were actually usually the most democratic and most lenient, which even surprised me, to be honest, because as long as I remember, Zhdanov has always been called a cultural dictator, but apparently he was a real democrat and strongly against any kind of bureaucratic tyranny. The one that really surprised me was Vyshinsky, because Vyshinsky was the guy who was the state prosecutor at all the Moscow trials. So he's always portrayed as an absolute monster, and because he was a prosecutor, I just always imagine him as this hardcore judge who just wants super tough sentences and whatnot. But apparently he, together with Zhdanov, were the biggest enemies of any kind of misuse of power, any kind of corruption or illegality by state officials, any kind of abuse of power. And Vyshinsky and Zhdanov were pretty much the people who brought Yezhov down, which did kind of surprise me. So there is some interesting stuff like that in the book, but again, to really get that out of it, you kind of already have to have an idea of who these people are and what's going on here. And most of the time, Getty's commentary doesn't really contribute anything. If he just published the documents themselves would be enough. Then, moving on, Getty's fourth book, Yezhov, Rise of Stalin's Iron Fist. It's a biography of Nikolai Yezhov. Nikolai Yezhov obviously was the head of the NKVD during the Great Purge, and after the Great Purge was over, he was accused of massive misuse of power, unjust killings, as a form of deliberate sabotage against the state, and also espionage on behalf of foreign states. Yezhov was accused of being part of the right opposition. Getty's book, however, doesn't go into any of that because he only talks about Yezhov's early career, his life before the Great Purge, which on paper maybe sounds like it could be interesting, but it's really not. And it really falls into this trap of just psychoanalyzing the crap out of Yezhov. It tries to see, okay, what kind of person is Yezhov, what is his personality, and then it tries to see, well, how did that lead to the Great Terror? And to me, it just doesn't explain anything. I think it does succeed in explaining why Yezhov was able to get to the position that he did. I think Getty probably is right about the fact that the Bolsheviks didn't have enough people, so they had to choose people who sometimes were not that high quality. It also has a bunch of interesting stuff about Yagoda, the leader of the OGPU and NKVD before Yezhov, and it shows really conclusively how absolutely corrupt Yagoda was, and it quotes Molotov. It has this really funny and revealing quote from Molotov, where Molotov says that, back in those days, we had so few police experts that we had to even work with absolute reptiles like Jagoda. When I read that, I was like, well, goddamn. Jagoda had been super corrupt. It was known already since 1928 that he had been implicated in really bad corruption, but they still couldn't remove him and didn't remove him because they didn't have anybody to really replace him with. And then Yezhov was chosen because he wasn't originally a policeman. Instead, he was in the party personnel department. But then that's pretty much it. Like, the rest of it is Getty just trying to psychologize Yezhov. And Getty, of course, has to somehow try to claim that all the oppositionists were completely innocent and that there was no secret organization trying to overthrow the government or trying to overthrow Stalin, even though he kind of admits that there was, but he also has to kind of say that there wasn't. So, for instance, Getty himself does say that, based on documents that have been found and documents that actually exist to this day, we know that in 1932, a secret underground organization called the Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites was formed. Later on, Jagoda was accused of being part of this organization. Getty wants to deny it, but the fact is that the secret Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites was formed in 1932. It was discovered in 1934, or maybe even earlier. In 1934, the Leningrad party secretary Sergei Kirov is assassinated by a follower of Zinoviev. Zinoviev was part of the Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites. So the Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites is later, at the Moscow trials, accused of assassinating Kirov. However, even though the NKVD already knew about the existence of this organization, this Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites, for years, they never went after any of those people except Trotskyists, and even in those cases, not very strongly. That is why in 1936 Stalin said that the NKVD is 4 years behind in solving this issue. So imagine this. They have known about this organization until 1936. Jagoda hadn't really told anybody, not even Stalin, that Zinovievites were involved in the organization. They had always only talked about Trotskyists. That's super weird, right? Why would Jagoda do that? I mean, he is the police. He's supposed to find out. Why is he shielding the Zinovievite assassins, terrorists who killed Kirov? Why would he do that if he wasn't in cahoots with them? But that's not all, because at the first Moscow trial in 1936, they of course go after Zinoviev. So they mention Trotskyists and Zinovievites. But they still don't mention anything about the right opposition, the rightists, even though it was the Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites. Not only Trotskyites, but Rights and Trotskyites. And they had known that at least since 1933 or 1934 or something, maybe even earlier, maybe right from the beginning. But in 1936, they don't mention anything about the rights. At the second Moscow trial in 1937, people at the trial, Pyatakov, for instance, I think he mentions some of the rightists. He mentions Bukharin, Tomsky, Rykov. Those people are still not arrested, they're not investigated, but they were kind of just mentioned. And it seems almost like there was an attempt to cover up the fact that they were mentioned. One of them, Tomsky, he kills himself when he hears that he was mentioned at the trial. And in his suicide note, he says, "Oh, Jagoda is one of us, F him, I'm killing myself," and then he does it. Then Jagoda says, "Okay, I was part of the right opposition in the past, but I didn't tell anybody ever." And only then they start to investigate the rights as well. And then it is revealed that indeed Jagoda had been a rightist himself. He was friends with all of them, even though he had always hidden it. So he looks like he's in cahoots with them. So how does Getty explain that somehow he is not in cahoots with them? Getty claims that Jagoda did all of this because of pure negligence, by accident. He admits that Jagoda was an old rightist. He admits that Jagoda was corrupt. He admits that Jagoda had basically botched the investigation, had shielded the Zinovievites, had shielded the rights completely. Of course, it's a possibility that he had done this either to protect the anti-state conspiracy, because he was part of it, but Getty instead claims that Jagoda had covered up all of this in order to cover up his own negligence, and also to cover up the fact that he himself used to be a rightist, even though he now supposedly wasn't anymore. But in the past he had been, and he would like to cover that up. And then Getty just assumes that, therefore, Jagoda is innocent, Jagoda wasn't actually a conspirator, blah blah blah. But even if all those things were interpreted in such a way, let's assume that Jagoda was corrupt, he had botched the investigation either by accident or on purpose, he was an old rightist, and that now looks suspicious. Let's assume that he wasn't part of the conspiracy at that point. Even if at that point he wasn't yet a conspirator, at that point he was already so screwed that it would have been pretty easy to coerce him into the conspiracy just for self-preservation. Think about it. If he wasn't trying to overthrow the government at that point, maybe he thinks, well, goddamn, I am truly screwed. But hey, if the conspiracy works and we overthrow the government, I'll be completely fine. So it actually makes a lot more sense to assume that he joined in the conspiracy, because everything else also points towards that, and it also just makes perfect sense. But Getty doesn't do that. The fact that Tomsky's suicide note says that Jagoda is a rightist conspirator just like they are, Getty doesn't even try to explain that. Same thing with Yezhov. Yezhov was accused of being part of the plot. Understanding how that would work out would require a level of understanding of Marxism, because Getty doesn't seem to understand how right oppositionists and left oppositionists could be on the same side against Stalin. He doesn't understand how acts which look ultra-left could amount to the same thing as acts which are right-wing. Let's say that somebody is a saboteur. Let's say they commit sabotage, but then they mask it as ultra-leftism. Well, this person could be part of the right opposition, but he's committing sabotage, but he's masking it as ultra-leftism. Therefore, Getty thinks, oh, he's an ultra-leftist, therefore he can't be a rightist. Or something like that. Because in many ways, Yezhov's actions look very ultra-left a lot of times. So I think Getty just can't comprehend, or he doesn't want to understand how Yezhov still could be part of the rightist conspiracy. Then there's stuff like Yezhov's second-in-command turns out to be a Japanese spy, which Getty himself even admits. He later defected to Japan. Getty doesn't explain what that means. He still just insists that no, Yezhov couldn't have been any kind of conspirator. He just dismisses that out of hand without any justification. So the Yezhov book mostly has some interesting stuff about Jagoda, and that's pretty much it. I can't really get into it too much because it's too complicated and just too niche and obscure, so there's no real point, but that's basically my opinion. Lastly, Getty's latest book, Practicing Stalinism, Bolsheviks, Boyars, and the Persistence of Tradition. I think this one, even though I've been very critical of all these books so far, I think this one might be the worst. Even though, I don't really hate it, it feels weird to say that it's the worst out of all of them, because I actually have the least strong feelings towards this one. The problem with Practicing Stalinism is that one is just truly baseless. It has very little substance to it. There's very little fact in it. It's mostly just Getty's opinions, and oftentimes they feel like really uninformed opinions. So what is the book actually about? Well, for some reason, at that point, I guess Getty decided that he had already done everything. Because all other books of his, they all kind of say the same thing. They say communism is bad, it's not as bad as we thought it was, but it's still bad, and that the totalitarian paradigm is false. So Practicing Stalinism tries to do something completely different. It's actually about culture. It doesn't really talk about the Purge or stuff like that specifically. Instead, it tries to claim that Soviet culture and Soviet communism is actually just Russian culture. And Getty tries to claim that Russia hasn't really culturally changed at all since the Middle Ages to the Soviet Union to today. And he seems to think that that's some kind of revolutionary new idea, when in reality that's like the oldest and stupidest story in the world. Because even during the Cold War, everybody was always saying, oh, Stalin is just a red czar. Like, there's that terrible book, In the Court of the Red Tsar. And there's all these books that say, like, oh, Stalin is like the czar. Communism is just a new serfdom or a new feudalism. Even the dumbest libertarian and dumbest conservative says that. But Getty has somehow reinvented that same argument, and he thinks it's so profound and deep. But he doesn't do it from the point of view of history, he does it from the point of view of culture, political culture. And I think that was fundamentally a bad idea, because he's not a cultural anthropologist, he's a historian, so I think he's kind of out of his own field in this. And he even says that, but I think everybody around him was just being a yes man and saying like, oh yeah, this is such a good book, even though it really isn't, at least in my opinion. However, I will admit that the idea is interesting. For me, I already thought about this topic quite a lot at one point, because when I started looking into socialist realism and the Marxist philosophy of art, I quickly realized that a lot of the big thinkers of socialist realism and Marxist philosophy of art are Russians. So it immediately occurred to me, is socialist realism truly universal, or is it purely Russian? Is it truly a Marxist idea, or is it more like a Russian idea? It was actually believed that Marx barely said anything about art. So therefore, Plekhanov, another Russian guy, the founder of Russian Marxism, Plekhanov, he was seen as the main theorist on art, because people thought that Marx didn't have anything to say about art, which is false, but that's what people thought. So they went to Plekhanov, and before Plekhanov there were great Russian revolutionary Democrats, Chernyshevsky and Belinsky, and others. In terms of music, there's also all these ideas about how music needs to be influenced by the masses and by folk music, music of the masses, and blah blah blah, which was very influential in Russia. So I thought, are these just Russian ideas, or are they truly Marxist ideas? But then when I looked more into it, I realized that socialist realism is absolutely Marxist. It's deeply grounded in Marx and Engels. It's not just a Russian idea. It's, to some extent, some of those ideas are just so universal that you can also find them in Russia before Marx, such as the idea that art needs to reflect reality, that art needs to be connected to the masses. Those are very universal ideas. So the topic is interesting, at least. But Getty comes to the opposite conclusion from me. I came to the conclusion that these ideas are actually Marxist ideas, whereas Getty comes to the conclusion that these are just Russian ideas, and that Russian Marxism wasn't really all that Marxist, it was mostly just Russians doing Russian stuff. He links this to the Great Purges in a way. He links this into Stalin's struggle against bureaucracy, because there actually were bureaucrats. Bureaucracy was probably the worst during the NEP, the late 20s, very early 30s, because that was still at a time when the party had relatively few qualified leaders, when the party needed to give the local leaders a lot of power during collectivization, when the democracy campaign had not started yet, and many other related things like that. So there actually were bureaucrats. However, Stalin didn't create them. Instead, Stalin eliminated them, either by kicking them out, expelling them, purging them, or simply by implementing deeper democracy, which then solved the problem, or at least alleviated the problem. But instead, what Getty claims is that this is not really so-called bureaucracy, but it's a type of feudalism. He says that this problem is basically an eternal Russian problem. He says that these local bureaucrats who Stalin purged or expelled or kicked out, or who were voted out later, Getty says that those people are more like the boyars, the Russian feudal lords, and that basically every faction was kind of a feudal clan, and that every Bolshevik leader was a type of feudal lord who had his own vassals under him. And the problem with that is that the democracy campaign should have really hindered that or ended that, because after thorough party democracy was implemented, anybody could just be voted out, so that's not really a thing. There is, of course, truth to his claim in one sense, but it also kind of renders his whole argument meaningless, because it's true that there are political families or political clans, or whatever you want to call them. There are people who are friends with each other, who know each other, and they're kind of a clique together. But that's not really a Russian thing. That's just some kind of networking. That's just having connections. Of course, connections can manifest differently in different ways. In capitalism, usually you have to have money, and then through money and business connections you have connections. In the USSR, it would have to happen somehow differently. Getty also says that if you were an old Bolshevik, you were considered like the highest type of aristocracy, and then if you were somebody who joined the party later, then you were not considered to be the same level of aristocracy or whatever, which almost sounds like it could be a point, but then it absolutely is not a point, because the oppositionists who got their asses handed to them and who were attacked in the media and in countless books and whatnot, and who were called traitors and enemies of the people and whatnot, they were old Bolsheviks. Zinoviev was an old Bolshevik. That didn't protect him. He was still convicted of treason and called an enemy of the people. Whereas some people who joined later were completely fine. A lot of people who were Mensheviks in the past were attacked, and then when they were attacked, people said like, oh yeah, didn't you used to be a Menshevik? But some people were Mensheviks in their past and they were still completely fine. So Getty's attempt to connect this into some kind of revolutionary aristocracy, some kind of revolutionary caste system based on what year you joined the party and whatnot, it just doesn't really work. I mean, it only works up to a point. Getty talks about apostolic succession. The stuff he says about Lenin's body being preserved obviously was pretty useful. I even made a video specifically about that. Getty talks about this idea of apostolic succession, where you would link yourself to some kind of source of legitimacy, either a living source or an ancestral source. Say how Stalin was characterized as the continuer of Lenin's work, or Lenin was seen as like the modern Marx or something. Getty would say, oh, that's apostolic succession, that's linking Lenin to Marx, therefore Lenin getting his legitimacy from Marx. Well, of course, that wouldn't work if Lenin was a complete idiot. If Lenin was a complete idiot, then nobody would think that he's the modern Marx. But of course, after the fact, since Lenin carried out the revolution, well, he's already seen as a great leader in his own right, so of course now they get to connect him to Marx. But the idea of apostolic succession is also not specifically a Russian idea. See what China tries to do. China tries to add a new ism with every single leader they have so that they can really force this idea of some kind of lineage. There's like marxism-leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping this and Xi Jinping that. Modern China denounces half of Mao's policies. Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, all that stuff. But they still somehow try to create this idea that they're continuing Mao's work somehow. So it's not a specifically Russian idea. Look at what the USA is doing. Every American leader tries to somehow get legitimacy through the Founding Fathers or through the Constitution or some kind of American way or whatever. So this is just a universal thing that seems to happen in the world. It's not a Russian thing. Bolshevism has similarities to many things. It has some similarities to other phenomena in Russia, but it has also been compared to many other things which are not Russian. It has famously been compared to religion. Why? I mean, that sounds absurd, right? Well, it is kind of absurd, but it actually has more in common with religion than it has with, I don't know, just random Russianness. For instance, a Bolshevik communist is a fighter with a cause. He proclaims some kind of message about a better world. In religion, they would call that a gospel, or they might call that a utopian promise or whatever. However, the same is true of all revolutionaries. Look at the French Revolution. Look at the British Enlightenment. Look at the American Revolution. They all have some kind of revolutionary gospel or revolutionary program. They're all fighters with a cause. Bolshevism and Marxism is very serious about doctrine, theory, ideology. They don't like revisionists, opportunists. So that's why some people say that, oh, communism is like a religion because they go after all the revisionists, they go after all the heretics. Even though that's only because Bolshevism takes Marxism more seriously and because it's deeply tied to philosophy. Anybody who takes philosophy seriously is going to discover if somebody deviates from it or not. Some other movements tie themselves to ideas of biology, such as are you a man or a woman, what color skin you have, what nationality, what race are you, or some other factor. Or they might have other ideological notions that they follow. For instance, Jordan Peterson advocates all kinds of weird ideas about how the world works, and his followers subscribe to those views. Trump and Biden have their own worldviews that their supporters accept, and if you disagree with them, they call you, I don't know, soy boy or something, or a Trumper, or who knows what. So I think practicing Stalinism, Bolsheviks, boyars, and the persistence of tradition ultimately fails miserably at what it's trying to do. The whole point of it is stupid in my opinion. And it just seemed silly, and I really expected something better from Arch Getty. So what is my overall opinion? Is Arch Getty an idiot? Well, of course not. He's not an idiot. However, he is an anti-communist. He doesn't understand Marxism, that's for sure. And the only reason that people recommend him is because the other stuff is way worse. It's not that his stuff is so good or correct, it's just the other stuff is just absolute garbage. And we all know that that's true, right? Getty's books are extremely mixed. Sometimes they have some good stuff, otherwise they are deeply flawed. I would not recommend them to somebody who is new to communism or who just wants some kind of popular history. I would recommend them to somebody who wants to research. But somebody who wants to research has to go way beyond just Getty, of course. To me, Getty is just one step further towards the left from the absolutely insane position that Sovietology used to adhere to in the past and largely still adheres to today. Something like Applebaum and Snyder is just as insane as Conquest and Solzhenitsyn in their day. And to me, Getty and his whole school of historians, the so-called revisionists, they represent an alternative kind of anti-communism and an attempt by anti-communism to fortify their positions and possibly retreat from certain positions that cannot be defended anymore. If something like Solzhenitsyn just becomes absolutely impossible to defend, well, then they'll just retreat to something like Kotkin. And if that becomes impossible, then maybe they'll retreat to something like Getty. But that's still really anti-communist. So it just seems like if one type of anti-communism fails, they'll still have this as a backup plan, basically.